Show that 54 gigawatts of offshore wind power can reduce carbon by the equivalent of taking roughly 18 million cars off the road. Currently, there is no incentive to produce wind energy. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists in January of 2014, the production tax credit, often referred to as PTC, is a federal incentive that provides financial support for the development of renewable energy facilities. Companies that generate electricity from wind are eligible for a federal PTC, which provides a 2.3 cent per kilowatt incentive for the first 10 years of a renewable energy facility's operation. PTC for wind and other renewable energy expired at the end of 2013. This shows that PTC is very important due to the benefit it gives companies to produce wind energy. Without an economic incentive, they will continue to produce non-renewable energy as it has a better financial benefit for them. Our second contention is the need to act. We have two reasons why we must act to solve this problem. First, global warming is real and is happening now, and is not a distant thought of the future. It is the only thing that explains the extreme weather that has been experiencing of lately. According to Hansen, the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in 2012, and a new analysis of the past 6 decades of global temperatures revealed a stunning increase in the frequency of extremely hot summers. This is not a climate model or a prediction, but actual observations of weather events and temperatures that have happened. Our analysis shows that there is no longer enough to say that global warming will increase the likelihood of extreme weather. To the contrary, our analysis shows that for extreme hot weather of the recent past, there is virtually no explanation other than climate change. The odds that natural variability created these extremes are minuscule and vanishingly small. This shows that the United States government needs to immediately take measures to drastically reduce the factors causing global warming. Second, offshore wind is a key renewable energy source. It can power a third of the United States. According to Berger, an independent environmental journalist, offshore winds of the U.S. Atlantic coast could yield enough clean renewable electric power for at least 1/3 of the entire U.S., according to Stanford University study released September 14. This includes some of the country's largest urban cities. As a result, we propose the following plan. The United States federal government should offer a long-term production tax credit for wind energy generated off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Our final contention is solvency, the reason why this plan will be successful. PTC is the single most important incentive for developing wind energy, a long-term extension. If the PTC is renewed for a substantial amount of time, companies will heavily invest in wind energy. According to Environment Georgia and the Georgia at the back of the pack in the race of the offshore wind, published in 2012, the Atlantic coast is an ideal location for offshore wind energy because of its high electricity demand and population density along the coast. This shows that not only will a PTC of offshore wind solve for global warming, but it will create jobs. PTC works. I now stand ready for cross-checks.
Okay, even if the United States federal government uses PTC and develops offshore wind, why does that mean that other countries like China, India, Russia, and major countries that emit a lot of GHGs will also use offshore wind or alternative energy?
Well, it doesn't mean that they're going to immediately follow behind us, but that doesn't mean that we don't have the moral obligation to start using renewable energy.
Why do we still have a moral obligation even if we can't do anything to solve warming?
Well, we will be doing our part in setting the lead for other countries to follow behind us. As we know, the United States is a world power, and often people say follow behind us on how we use our energy. So we would start the forefront for using renewable energy.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
All right. Is everybody good?
Yeah.
Okay. The affirmative would be disastrous for tepid economic growth that's happening right now. Charlie Cook, political analyst for the National Journal, writes on May 12th of 2014 that consumer confidence in the economy is on the rise and pretty close to the highest it's began since the last recession. He goes on to say, however, that any new swings in the spending could hurt our economy as the economy still remains fragile. If our economy is doing fine right now, then we should stick with the status quo, or else there might be a double-dip recession that can hamstring the economy for years to come. The plan will change the situation because the PTC for wind farms harms the economy by spending money and diverting investment away from important priorities. Christine Harbin, Federal Issues Campaign Manager for the American Prosperity Institute, writes in 2014 that the production tax credit for offshore wind power may be a net jobs loser as it distracts labor and capital from more efficient areas in the economy and slows overall growth. She also indicts the affirmative solvency argument, saying that any boost to the economy among wind turbines makers is inherently temporary. The economic swing that would happen as a result of the plan would be disastrous, and we must avoid them because any new economic shocks would put millions of people into poverty and crisis. Harry Bradford, an associate editor for the Huffington Post, remarks in 2013 that because hundreds of millions of people worldwide are on the brink of poverty, a new economic shock would make it so they cannot afford basic needs like food, water, and shelter. Finally, there is no reason that the affirmative is good. Our moral obligation cannot be fulfilled by offshore wind farms because they are too expensive to implement. Brady Nelson, an economist from the Heartland Institute, says that offshore wind farms do not compete with coal and natural gas because they cannot provide electricity at an economically competitive price. This means that the affirmative itself is not a fruitful project to undertake. If the affirmative cannot displace our current consumption of fossil fuels, it does not solve global warming, and it does not do anything good. And now I'm ready for gossips.
So can you please explain how PTC takes away from what we need to invest in?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of things that the federal government is investing in right now, like social services, welfare spending, Medicaid, Medicare, and including a bunch of other alternative energy projects. A PTC would distract money away from those and make it so the government cannot afford to spend money on important projects and instead is spending money towards an offshore wind project that would not succeed.
Okay, but you said that they're making investments toward alternative energy?
Yeah, they're trying to, yeah.
So do you think that offshore wind farms will provide alternative energy?
I don't think that they will be competitive, no.
Although I think the negative makes a lot of really good arguments in their speech, one thing that they don't contest is the reality of global warming. They have not answered our argument that global warming is real, that global warming is caused by humans, and that global warming is getting worse. What all of this means is that we have no choice but to do offshore wind. It may be that offshore wind is a little bit more expensive. It may be that offshore wind might be hard to implement in some ways. But given that global warming is here and it's going to be so bad, I don't think we have a choice. They make the argument that wind would be too expensive. I think this is wrong for two reasons. First is that we make wind less expensive. The plan would offer an incentive for companies to build offshore wind. It would give them money for doing it, which means it wouldn't cost that much money to build the wind farms. Second, we aren't investing in the lowest cost energy. Even if coal is a lower cost right now, that doesn't take into account all of the costs that coal will cause in the future when global warming causes terrible effects around the world, which means that in the end, we're still the lowest cost energy. Now, they make this argument about the economy. First, global warming is going to be far worse for the economy. According to the Center for American Progress, estimates of climate refugees currently range from 25 to 50 million as a result of natural disasters that will stem from climate change. The Center for American Progress, which is a think tank, concludes that because we shoulder a large portion of the responsibility for current levels of global warming pollution, we have a moral responsibility to invest in solutions that will help ourselves and the world. Second, in the 1AC, we referenced a piece of evidence from Environment Georgia. That piece of evidence concludes that wind energy would generate $200 billion in economic activity and generate more than 43,000 permanent, high-paying jobs in manufacturing, construction, engineering, operations, and maintenance. All of that means that wind energy would be good for the economy in the short term. Finally, the economy is resilient. We know from 2008 that the economy can go through a lot of bad effects, that there can be serious declines in the economy, but it will never rise to the level of 900 million people falling into poverty. That's simply an exaggeration on their part and something that I don't think will take place. I stand ready for cross-examination.
All right, so you make this argument that the plan would generate a ton of new jobs. The Dutch government invested in offshore wind farms, and they didn't see much economic growth. Why would it be different in the United States?
So that article that you referenced said the Dutch government tried to invest in offshore wind and then decided it was too expensive and gave up on it.
Okay.
I think if we have an actual commitment to offshore wind, then we can see that economic growth as long as we're willing to commit to it.
So the Dutch government realized it was too expensive because it didn't compete with coal and natural gas, and so people weren't interested in investing in it. Why would it be different in the U.S.'s case?
So I think you're totally right that wind would be more expensive in the short term, but in the long term, if we're willing to support it, it's going to end up being cheaper because coal and natural gas will eventually run out and because climate change will have such terrible effects.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to be addressing the case argument. Okay, the affirmative has said that warming is real and is caused by humans. However, even if some of those things are true, we don't know enough about warming and it's too uncertain. We have no moral obligation. Here's evidence from Richard Harris in 2013. Curry is a school of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She focuses on uncertainties and unknown unknowns. I've been trying to understand how there can be such a strong consensus given these uncertainties. While humans may be contributing to climate change, we don't know how the climate will behave in the coming decades, so there may be no point in trying to reduce emissions. We've gone through warming and cooling trends. This evidence indicates that we may not have a moral obligation because there are so many uncertainties. Now, extend 1 and C number 1, our Nelson and 11 evidence. Prefer our evidence because he has a PhD in economics and is talking about whether or not wind will be economically competitive. The Netherlands provides an empirical example of why offshore wind will fail. Even if it is deployed on a large scale and subsidized by the government, just like the plan, offshore wind will never be economically competitive against fossil fuels. There are a couple of reasons. The first is there are huge maintenance and capital costs. The second reason is that offshore wind is at the mercy of the weather. Sometimes there are strong winds and sometimes there are weak winds, and it's not a reliable electricity or alternative energy source. If there is no solvency, there's no moral obligation to solve warming because there's no reason why the plan would actually do anything effective. Here's another reason why the plan would never solve. China GHG emissions and the inability of the plan to get other countries on board means that warming is inevitable. Here's evidence from Fergus Green in 2014. China's coal use is a major source of GHG emissions and increases climate change. China was responsible for a quarter of the world's fossil fuel consumption. If coal consumption continued to grow, as experts project, emissions would exceed 15 gigatons CO2 by 2030, making it impossible to move onto an emissions reductions pathway. And now stand ready for questions.
All right, so you make a lot of arguments about how there might be a lot of different kinds of problems with offshore wind. What kind of solutions do you offer for dealing with the problem of global warming?
Well, our argument is that the plan would be ineffective and that it's more important to maintain economic levels as they are currently. So in order to solve for things like natural disaster mitigation, etc., we need to have a strong economy and the ability to respond to those kind of things in order to mitigate the impacts of warming.
Okay. You say that warming is sort of uncertain and that it might be natural. How certain do you think we have to be about global warming in order to act on it?
Well, our argument is that since there are negative effects, things like economic collapse and deterioration of the economy, that we should be more careful and not just spend a lot of money and invest in uncertain things like offshore wind.
Right, thank you.
The shocks to the economy as a result of the plan would be worse than the problems that they're trying to solve. There are 900 million people currently living on less than $1.25 a day that are not able to afford food, shelter, and other basic needs. Even if the affirmative solves the problems of the climate, they will make the situation worse because the plan happens. We are stuck in a bad economic situation right now, but it's improving. If companies and producers view the economy as slouching back towards another recession, they will switch back to fossil fuels, which means that the affirmative cannot solve global warming enough to limit climate change, because people wouldn't think that offshore wind is competitive if the economic situation is bad. Also, the economy is reverse causal, which means it solves global warming over the long term. Only a strong economic climate means that people would be investing in alternative energies like solar power and others, which means the economy solves global warming. Now, global warming cannot hurt the economy. It will take a long time before it does anything to cause climate refugees, and the economy can exacerbate the effects of those climate refugees over the long term. The plan throws fragile recovery off the rocker. Harbin comments that the PTC is so lavish and anti-cost competitive that the wind power produced often causes people to bid negative prices into the electrical grid just so they can collect on the subsidy. These pet projects have gone bankrupt in every single situation, and they stick taxpayers with the bill, which hurts fragile economic growth that's happening now. She's more qualified than their evidence, which is from the Georgia Environmental Advocacy Group. Even if they produce jobs, it'll only be in the short term. Now, the economy is not resilient. First, you shouldn't risk economic collapse. They haven't answered the argument that economic collapse would be bad for millions and would cause poverty, which means that we should just win on magnitude itself. Second is that double-dip recessions are much more likely after the first swing. Charlie Cook comments that growth is coming right now, but is in danger and is dependent on greater revenue, which only the plan can throw off.
Global warming is happening now, and we have to act now. The opposing side has not said that anything regarding global warming not being an effect that we are having to go through. There's only one factor, which is climate change, that is going on. And this will cause, as it gets worse, refugees to come in and hurt the economy even more. We are helping the economy in solving for jobs, and we do not, and if we do not solve for climate change, we will have ongoing climate refugees. Well, as I stated before, will continue for our economy to go down. The magnitude of global warming cannot be changed. The magnitude, therefore, we win. And the ongoing PTC will help solve for these pet projects that they save for. When we stop the PTC and go on and off again, it leaves for economies not to, companies not to have faith in what that wind energy can do. Therefore, we're proposing that we have an ongoing PTC that will help us solve for the economy and for global warming.
The plan costs a ton of money and will drain the economy. They have conceded that the economy is on the rise but is still fragile. In a world where the plan happens, we would enter into an economic recession. There are a couple of reasons why this is important. First, they've conceded that economic recessions cause things like poverty, food shortages, lack of shelter, and people have no basic needs. This is a prerequisite and more important than solving for things like global warming. The first reason is because of time frame. These things happen much quicker because in a world of economic collapse, people will start losing their food and ability to survive very quickly. Global warming happens much longer, and the plan's ability to solve is even longer because they have to win that the impacts happen in order for them to become cost competitive. They've also conceded a couple of key arguments in the 1R. The first is that the plan, or that the economic recession would prevent alternative energies from ever being able to solve because we would revert to fossil fuels because they are cheaper. The second argument is that we would be able to solve global warming in the long term. In a world where we have a strong economy, people will feel safer taking more risky investments into things like alternative energy. This means that even if they win that we have a moral obligation to solve things like global warming, preventing the economy from collapsing is the best way to do so. They say that they can solve jobs in the short term and that their refugees will help the economy. However, those jobs would only be temporary and they can't solve in the long term. They have to prove that PTC and offshore wind would be cost competitive first. The last argument I'm going to make is they've conceded that other countries like China mean that GHG emissions will be inevitable, so we have to try to solve the economy first.
The question you should ask yourself at the end of this debate is, what solutions does the negative have for global warming? They don't have an answer to the argument that global warming is going to cause 25 to 50 million climate refugees fleeing from natural disasters. This will have catastrophic effects not only on those refugees, but also on all of us, because all of us will have to deal with the effects of that huge refugee flow, and it will be catastrophic for the world and for the economy. Our hands-on evidence indicates that global warming is already here, so when they tell you that global warming is slow or that global warming is something far in the future, this is entirely missing the point. When they say we need to focus on the economy first, this is exactly the sort of flawed reasoning which has got us into this situation in the first place. We've said over and over again we can't afford to invest in renewable energy because it's too expensive and we have to focus on any other things first. The fact is that global warming is already here, so if we're ever going to do it, it has to be now. The logic we says that we can figure out later simply is not acceptable. We create a lot of jobs in the short term, which means that even if there is some possibility that offshore wind is less competitive, there are still jobs in construction, manufacturing, there's jobs to run the wind farms, which means that any economic decline that would happen because of the plan would be very small, and global warming is far more important.